Good evening. Welcome to Sullivan Says Live at 5. I'm Jerry Sullivan. I'm the chief columnist and founder of Sullivan Says SoCal, and it's a pleasure to have you tonight. We're going to have a talk today about media. And, this conversation tracks in my mind back to, it was a couple of years ago when, through a series of fortunate conversations, I got a chance to donate the archives of a community newspaper I had years ago. It was called the Los Angeles Garment and Citizen, and it covered the central core of the city of Los Angeles and surrounding areas, and was around for about 10 years. And I had the archives, and I got a chance to donate them to the Huntington Library in San Marino. It's a world-class, world-renowned research library, and it's my great pleasure, and I'm very much appreciative that those archives now have a home there in their California collection. And that process, that got me thinking about the state of the industry that I've worked in for my whole adult life. And really, I began to realize, sometimes you realize when you're living through a meltdown, and that this is an industry that is melting down and reforming. I started looking into it, and I noticed that 20% of the newspapers, local newspapers in America, have closed in the last 10 or 15 years. There's a couple thousand newspapers. Very often, the sole source or main source of news in a smaller community or for a neighborhood in a larger community. And all that was going through my mind when I had a conversation with a gentleman who mentioned to me a documentary called Social Dilemma and recommended I watch it. And I did. And it was disturbing and challenging, and also started to inform my thoughts about where we are with media these days and the ongoing meltdown and reformation, or whatever is going on with how we communicate with one another and perceive the world around us to a great degree. And so I'd like to start today with talking with the gentleman who recommended that documentary in the first place, Emil Haddad. He's the chairman emeritus of 5 Point Holdings. And welcome, Emil.
Nice to see you, Jay.
It's good to see you, and thanks for joining us. And I guess it was probably about a year ago when you first mentioned that to me, and it's actually been kind of on my mind ever since. And I want to talk to you for several reasons. First, I know you're generally thoughtful about these matters, but you brought 5 Point Holdings into fruition, or into being. You were the founder, and brought it to fruition with several really major developments: the Great Park in Irvine, Valencia, Northern LA County. You have some projects up in North, and in that role, you had a company that was covered by the media. You had a company that relied on advertising in the media, so you engage the media in different ways, and all the while you're a father and a community member and a thoughtful person. And I know I watched that documentary, and I walked away concerned. And I don't think, should I be less concerned or more concerned a year later?
More.
Yeah. How do you? Where are we with media right now?
I mean, I think that the evolution of this of social media and its influence on the way we think, the way we behave, the way we communicate with each other, I believe that what we're seeing is basically a tip of an iceberg. I think that it's the whole concept of media and communication is going to become a totally different concept, because it used to be that you would be on the receiving end of information. You will analyze, you will agree, you disagree, and you come to a conclusion. Today, I think that, and that's what social media highlighted, is we are being programmed to think in a certain way. This is no more advertising, for instance, in the media, the way you mentioned it. Back when I started in the industry, not long ago, we used to advertise for a home. And the idea is, if there's about 5,000 people who are reading the ad, probability is that a few of them might be looking for a home, and if we're lucky, it becomes the home they choose. Today, that's not at all what happens. Nobody's doing that anymore. Today, You're going and looking for who's buying baby clothes, who's not buying liquor anymore, which means that they're probably pregnant, who is just got married. We are starting to direct everything, and we're starting to speak directly to individuals. Now, that's all good, except that if you extrapolate from that, Jerry, and start thinking about the fact that we are now starting to get into the mind of individuals, that becomes much more akin to I'm not going to call it a cult, but it's no more allowing people to take information and come to a conclusion. You're basically brainwashing them in a sense. And let's call it what it is. And I think that's dangerous, because that's how, empires were built. That's how political parties get built in different parts of the world. So I can tell you, you're right to be concerned. I am concerned. And I watched the new generation that basically takes the soundbite of a packaged, concluded message and takes it at face value. It must be right. If I got it through my favorite social media, it must be right. And that's scary.
And, and you did mention, I would do want to emphasize for everybody, it's, the digital revolution, the digital age, all the high-tech development has brought some enormous benefits. I've run a publication in the old days on paper and ink and run one digitally. And I can tell you, digitally, there's a lot of savings. There's a lot of efficiency. There's a lot of things that, a lot of communication can get done that simply couldn't have gotten done before. And that's all laudable and valuable. But you mentioned the downside, and you have some experience in the downside, societal downside. And part of that experience is living through Lebanon's descent into civil war, and really, becoming a country that really you couldn't have a home there anymore. Do you see, is it over dramatic to bring that up as a parallel at this point with the United States?
Look, I don't think it's over dramatic. Fortunately, we're not at that point in terms of the pressurization of the cylinder. But I can tell you, I'm starting to see pressurization. I'm starting to see the cylinder being pressurized. If you go back to the day when we got split during the hanging Chad, we got split along a line that was...
For some listeners, that's the 2000 election, Bush Gore, when it came down to a hanging Chad in Florida.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the country was split 50-50, basically, but it was split along a partisan line that says you're either on this side or that side. Today, when you listen carefully, the country is fragmented along many lines. Very many of them are emotional. And when you start pumping each of these and making it feel like the reason you are where you are and you don't like the situation is because of the other piece that is part of your country, that's dangerous. Because whereas people might think it is a platform that becomes an easier platform to win elections, but what I saw in my old country is that ended up at a place where it ran out of control. And when the street is out of control, you can't control it. Now, I'm not saying that we're there, but I'm saying that we need to be cognizant of it. And we need to know that when you have access to people, when you can actually speak to them directly, you have a responsibility. And you have to be very careful about that.
And one of the things about that, I'll go back to the documentary, Social Dilemma, was what became apparent, or what I came to believe after seeing it, is that there is now a business model behind polarization on digital media, social media. And by the way, nearly every newspaper in America is also now digital. And so, again, the notion of everything, the meltdown and Reformation, it's all coming together and reforming. But it's the constant, it seems almost like the best business model is a constant cycle of provocation and reaction, or stimulus and reaction. And oftentimes the more polarizing, the better. Can you, again, going back to your experience in Lebanon, does that match up? Is it that sort of provocation reaction?
It does. I mean, look, we see it. I mean, we don't need to name any particular names, but there's a lot of that going on right now that is starting to create more and more polarization. Now, I don't want to highlight only the negatives of social media and digital, as you said, because there's a lot of benefits. But we always have to look at the dangerous side of things and be aware of them so we don't end up being caught off guard like what happened in my previous life. But yes, I can tell you, I am seeing polarization right now, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm seeing it more than I've seen before. Look, there was a time when you would listen to any station, a TV station, and you're listening to the news, and almost all the news will be the same. And as I said, you might agree, disagree. But today, what we do is we turn on our favorite channel that tells us what we want to think, what we want to hear. I mean, today, if you're on the right side, you're going to listen to Fox, and Fox is telling you exactly what you want to hear. And if you're on the other side, you listen to CNN. I mean, as examples. So when you start actually listening to somebody who tells you what you want to hear, rather than put facts in front of you and allowing you to come to a conclusion, that becomes a very slippery slope.
Now, so you lived through a society that eventually came apart at the seams, and I'm wondering about the timing of it. How long did you feel that the society in Lebanon was veering out of control before it actually got out of control? Because the one thing I fear now is digital has put us all on fast forward. I don't think we have as much time to course correct or to see we're heading the wrong direction. But what was the timeline like in Lebanon?
Well, the circumstances obviously were different because the makeup of the social makeup of the population is different than here. There's a lot of more historical issues. So there's a lot of factors you have to think through when you think about how quickly we got to that point. But I can tell you, I was born in 1958, and my mom tells me that in 58, when I was born on the 14th of June, she woke up to the sound of gunfire. So, it started, I'm going to say, in the, mid-50s sometime, and maybe around when I was born, and it finally exploded in 75. So if you think about it, I was born in 58, and when I was 17, we were in full-blown civil war, and the country hasn't gotten out of it. So in the life of nations, 15 and 20 years is not that long. And I think that that's really where we need to be cognizant of some of what we're seeing today in terms of the emotional, pumping up. And because I don't want to see us 5 years. Look, it's not getting better. It's a trend. You look at it 2 years ago, it was better than today. And 3 years ago, it was better than 2 years ago. And so if we're moving in a trend that is the wrong trend, we need to be aware of it. It doesn't matter how long. We just have to change the attitude.
Got it. And I appreciate you taking that look back. And we're going to also look forward here. First, I'd like to break, and we'll show an ad here from our sponsor. And when I return, we'll be joined by another guest, and then chat a little bit and bring Emil back and get on with the conversation.
There's something that calls us here, to the edge of a coast, to a place where big ideas are born. At Chapman University, you will experiment boldly, act thoughtfully, live beautifully, explore tirelessly. And when the world asks you what you can do, you will answer, anything imaginable.
And we're back. Thank you. And thanks to Chapman University for that message. Now I'd like to introduce Daniela Gerson. She's a professor at Cal State Northridge, and welcome her to the show today. How are you, Daniela?
I'm good. Thanks for having me here.
Good. Thanks for joining us. And professor of journalism, and you've been a practicing journalist. And so would you want to just take a minute and tell us a little bit about yourself and your perspective on this matter?
Yeah, I would say that I actually started my journalism career at a point where most of our stories were not on the web. It was about 2003. I was working in a New York City newsroom after September 11th and in the aftermath. And you saw the shift from the broadsheet in just a very few years to where journalism is today, which is very different. I worked at a daily in New York, and I worked at public radio in New York. I worked in Europe. I worked at actually the first digital news outlet I worked at was at Der Spiegel's online English edition in Germany. And one of the things they said was that they always had to put like Nazis or a sex scandal in it to just get the numbers up. And the question of how things started to move digitally became pretty clear to me. I've worked really at a sort of a space between engagement journalism, which depends a lot on social media. It's the question of how do you get people to be part of the conversation? And it really highlights a lot of the incredible innovation that has happened through this digital space, but it also brings up many of the challenges at the same time. I've also covered immigration since the beginning of my career at the daily newspaper in New York. And when I haven't been reporting about immigrants, I've also worked on this question of how do you provide news and information to immigrant communities. In Los Angeles, I worked at a USC project in Alhambra, where we had a multilingual news website, which was based on research to try and connect with different communities. And actually one of the most effective projects we did there used Weibo, which is a Chinese version of Twitter. And we worked partly with the police department to connect to residents about local crimes. And that exploded in a way that we had about 40,000 followers pretty quickly on Weibo.
Now, and just for some background, now with Weibo, and you're in the San Gabriel Valley, was that aimed at the Chinese American population there?
It was mostly Chinese immigrant because this was in about 2009. And most of the community at that time in Alhambra, and I don't think the demographics are that different now, about a half were from China, mostly mainland China, or a half were Asian, mostly from mainland China.
Yeah, and that's really one of the reasons I'm glad you were able to join us, because I think you've seen communities and media engagement with communities that most of us never see. And, there are interesting areas and niches and everything else that I think, we really need to start examining all of them. One of the things I wonder about is when you're dealing with an immigrant community, is there more of a desire for very practical news? And does that cut down on the salacious or the polarizing, or is it about all the same?
So I would break that question down by what is the news that's really serving immigrant communities? And that's different from the reporting I did in New York of what's the news about immigrants. And I often when you look at the tradition, we've had news outlets serving immigrant communities going back as far as there were immigrants in this country. At one time, there was 1,000 newspapers in German. But at that time, news outlets serving immigrant communities really served three roles. One is for home country news. Another is to get settled here. And for that, when you ask about sort of news you can use or service journalism, that's a huge role. And the other is to connect you to the community that's here. So I would say that those are like the three major roles. Now, digital media and social media completely disrupted media outlets serving immigrant communities, because no longer did you have to rely upon a newspaper for home country news. You also didn't to connect to other people here. I mean, if you look at the number of Facebook groups, for example, for Brazilians, since we brought up my Brazilian connection, in Los Angeles, and before that it was this Google platform called Orkut, which was very big in Brazil as a social network. So you no longer needed the news outlet to create those connections or home country news. And the service journalism actually is a very important role that news outlets still serve. The problem is that so many of these news outlets are really hurting. And then many are also in sort of a step behind digitally from the communities they're serving. So the new immigrant communities are coming often with more advanced technology than the news outlets serving them, not that different than local news here often.
That's very interesting. You bring up several interesting points. And at this point, I'd like to welcome Emil back to join us and expand the conversation a little. And I wanted to pick up on something Emil mentioned about, when we get into the algorithmic sort of approach where they're checking, somebody's checking, what did the person just buy? Does that make them a likely target? Let's give them this news story and then float this ad behind it because we know they're at that point in their life. And it gets a little scary and everything else. And from your respective perspectives, I wanted to ask, meaning, Emil, you as a private sector veteran, and Daniela as an educator and journalist, is there room for regulation there? Should we attempt any sort of regulation, or is this freedom of expression and to be left alone and sorted out by the market?
Not to answer that, but I will add one point, and then I'm going to drop this to you, Emil. But I think that one thing to think about, and you haven't brought up yet, is the whistleblower this week. And there's apparently another whistleblower who wants to testify before Congress. But one of the elements that
sorry, why don't you just background on the whistleblower for viewers who may not be up to speed?
So there was a Wall Street Journal investigation that highlighted incredible amounts of inside documentation about the way in which Facebook functioned. One of the people behind that was a whistleblower who was a woman who has worked at Facebook and other Silicon Valley companies and came forward to testify to Congress regarding improprieties happening at Facebook. And one of the elements that I thought was particularly interesting was that after the January 6th insurrection, some of the elements of the algorithm that rewarded stories that had false information were taken down, like the algorithm was shifted and then it went back. And the proof that the algorithm rewards with sort of false information was, actually, I want to make sure I get this correct because I can't remember if it was exactly false information or violence. But either one, you showed to me the problems of a business drive. I mean, the business interest was to have more stories up there that include, that could push people toward violent ends. And so that, in terms of the question of regulation, is should a company be allowed that has such a huge force on our democracy and how we communicate to not be more regulated?
Emil?
So since Danielle decided to give me the easy part of the answer, you're talking to somebody who's lived all his life in a very highly regulated industry. And regulation could be very dangerous. I'm going to answer the question differently. I'm going to say, I think we should hold people responsible for what they say. I don't know that it is regulation, because I think regulation is a one-size-fits-all, and it sort of has a side to it that bothers me. But I think that what we need to do is say, look, today you cannot scream fire in a movie theater. That's not a violation of your freedom of speech. It's you cannot create mass panic and hurt people. I think that if we take that concept and apply it to today what's being said on social media that could actually create mass panic or destroy somebody's reputation, because unfortunately everything that's posted must be right. I think if we start thinking about holding people responsible, and I don't know in what form, I don't know if it is regulation at the end of the day or not. I think that's what we should do. Now, Daniela said something else, which is actually very interesting. She mentioned the word algorithms. See, I would be much more comfortable if there's a human being making a judgment call on what goes up and what goes down and what gets posted and what gets posted. But when we now are relying on algorithms that are programmed to do things for a totally different purpose, whether it's to attract audience or whether to dissect data or whether to package our information to sell it to somebody, when we are starting to rely on algorithms that makes decisions as to what goes up and goes down, now we're getting into the Space Odyssey movie.
I mean, we're deep in it. And the algorithms, the goal is to keep you on site as long as possible.
Exactly.
It's what every company is doing, as you know, and it's what media outlets are learning from as well. And I think, we always knew in media, like if it bleeds, it leads. And this type of story, the incredible amounts of data they have also show us where human interests go, and it's not pretty.
No, it's the old tabloid journalism was one thing, but to inform that then with an algorithm of this nature is just, it really is. And I'm a journalist by trade and have been my whole life, and I get very touchy of anytime freedom of expression looks like it's going to be infringed upon. I tend to be almost an absolutist in that regard. But I like the notion of people being held accountable. Now that gets difficult because right now, is Google accountable for what everyone posts through Google? And they're not. And so you got to do some sorting and everything.
Do you want someone tracking this? Right, this is live streaming.
Yeah, I mean, today if you use Uber and you get bad service, there's a mechanism by which it actually dings Uber for something. I mean, if we have a bad track record of customer service, we get dinged as a company for doing that. Google cannot get away with saying, I don't have responsibility in it. People come in and say whatever it is, and they can ruin anybody's reputation. So I think it's not a simple answer, and it's a very complex one, but it's one that has to be thought through. And I'm not in favor of every time we have something, let's put the government in charge and regulate it somehow, because I think in many times when you regulate, you're actually punishing the majority that is not, abusive of the system.
Yeah, and we have a form of regulation in libel law. Right? So if you apply libel law to, I think one of the problems is not everybody has, has the resources that makes it financial sense to sue them, right? And so then you look for who's behind that, and then there's a liability firewall, and so on and so forth. It all gets very complicated. The whistleblower case that Daniela was, going over. When you think about it, the Wall Street Journal has done, a load of reporting on that, and to me, they've done a load of very good reporting. Okay. They also have reason to, they do compete with Facebook.
They also rely upon Facebook. They promote all their content on Facebook.
There's just a lot of cross currents and cross connections and a lot to sort out. And again, the notion of this sort of, meltdown, everything coming together, being reformed. Where would you see it going?
I've spoken, so Facebook consulted, I had a conversation where they were consulting with me and others on how they determine which news stories to include in their news. Since this conversation is about specifically the media element, which news stories to include, and particularly with immigrants serving media outlets, some of these community media outlets, there's a plethora of news outlets, and the standards all news outlets keep are not the same. And so one of the elements of Facebook is they elevate news coverage, but how do they determine which news coverage to include and to market as news or not? Every element of, we are so entrenched in these social networks, and they're very smart people working on some of these self-regulation, specifically around news, both with Twitter and Facebook, but it's very messy.
I remember, Emil, you telling me, we were talking a few years ago, and you said, the millennials, some people, complain about they're a little bit difficult to deal with, some people feel. But, they have a smartphone. And if you're telling them something that doesn't make sense, they'll look it up right when you're talking and call you on it. And there's a lot good about that. The millennials also now are having children. So they're not necessarily those youngsters that we're talking about anymore. Daniela, what's it look like in your classroom? Who are you teaching? And how do they differ?
So my students are mostly first generation college students. But what's really interesting is we do have some return students. I have one student who was born in Cote d'Ivoire and then grew up in France, worked as an interpreter, and teaches at a preschool now. So when I say it, most of my students are in their 20s, and they come from across Los Angeles, but there's a variety. And in terms of how they're looking at news, very few look at the Los Angeles Times, and very few of their parents look at the Los Angeles Times. Many watch television, and all are on social media. Many of their parents, they say, and they themselves get their news via social media. Some have written when I've asked it, I get my news via social media like everybody does. That is considered a place to get news. Now, where, how do you verify? These are questions, and these are journalism students. So I think the question of what constitutes news and what your sources are, there's no unifying source. If at one point most people got their news from a local newspaper or from the nightly news report, that does not exist anymore. In terms of social media, they're really active, particularly since the pandemic, on communication apps. I mentioned Discord is one that I think many have adopted, and they're off of Facebook, but they're still on Instagram, and so they're on other Facebook products.
So, no real common source of news. And to some extent, that means no real common ground or common understanding. Emil, you've spent a career building communities, which really, it's almost in their name, common ground. Has the concept of community changed in the digital world? What is a community these days?
So, I think that the community used to be bound by geography, and people will have a common interest, whether it's a country or whether it is a community. The thing that ties a community together used to be a geography. You have to be part of the same place and have some common interest, and that's how even countries were created. But then within that country, some people had a little bit of different interests. But the common factor was geography. What I think we're seeing, and we have started seeing with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, is I think we're starting to see the first generation of virtual nations, virtual communities, where people who have common interests are not bound by geography. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is the one thing that today people are still, I'm not sure that they got their head around it, is when we talk about Facebook and they have 1 billion people who are following them. They have a captive audience of 1 billion people population. That is everywhere in the world. And that is a nation. That's a very large nation that you can have an ability to influence them, and they all are coming to you because they have an interest in what you have to provide them. So when you ask me about the community, and I have been thinking a lot about it in our business, where I might be in San Francisco, in LA, and in Orange County, and we would have looked at each one of these as a separate community. Today, one of the reasons that I'm decided to make this transition and look at doing things differently is because I want to start imagining, how do I bring all these places together under the 5-point community, and what are the things I can do so I can connect people, although they're geographically not connected.
And where are you starting on that? Just to let people know, you recently decided to step back from day to day. You're in a emeritus advisory role. You could kind of get a chance to kind of pursue your intellectual approach to things a little more than without the stricture of the day-to-day business. Where are you going to start? Where do you start?
Well, I'm starting by talking to a lot of younger people who are actually helping me understand what's in their mind, and I can help them then think about how do we steer it into the future. Because, if I'm not talking today to Gen Y and Gen Z, if I'm not trying to understand what is their interest, I don't know really. I'm actually planning for the past and the future. But, as you know, we have a lot of things that we do on the healthcare side, on the entertainment side, on things to where we say to people, forget about me as a developer. We used to be thought of as a developer or a builder. Think of me as a community builder. And think of me as somebody who's building relationship and connections between all of you, so I can become the quote unquote concierge of your life, making sure that you're all connected in a certain way. Can I tell you exactly how that model is going to look like? If I would, then I would have done it. But I can tell you, I'm going to spend the next decade thinking about it, because I know for a fact that I can change the way that communities are going to be built going forward, because you have today people who are conscious about the environment. I mean, Jerry, I have a friend of mine and he's helping us right now, and we're talking about that over dinner. If I can have you be riding your bike, and I can have you bank all of the carbon emissions that you save by not driving your car, and I can have that be within a community, and that could be monetized to you, because there's no reason for Exxon to go buy greenhouse gas from the Amazons, and they're burning it to strict supply so they can push the price up. If I can actually have you be connected in a way that is environmentally conscious, socially conscious, then I've taken a first step into how the world's going to look like tomorrow.
And that's a community you're envisioning. You're in the process of trying to create wherever it might go. Daniela, if you were going to create a newspaper or a publication or the media for that community, what would it look like?
I think that's an interesting question. I think one thing that we have seen is this concept you touch on, Amila, communities of interest. And, we've always had groups and ways people get together, but they have really taken off in such huge ways. And so that people can connect in a way that's not geographically tied. And the places that I am seeing real growth that could be a model for this is, when you look at, there's a Punjabi radio station out of San Jose that is on all sorts of different platforms. It's not on one platform dependent, but it knows where Punjabis are, many Punjabi Americans are truck drivers. And so it's been particularly good at crossing boundaries and being literally mobile in terms of where people connect. But then it also connects with the Punjabi diaspora community around the world. And they have learned to create these connections, but also not have it be platform dependent. And so I think that is something that's really important for any news outlet, is to be able to think of what are the communities of interest that I want people to really feel like they're part of it, that they are seen. And I do think, and this is both a good and bad, is that the communities, whether they're ethnic communities, geographic, but also, I'm someone who bikes. So you brought up the bike. Like, I love my cargo bike, where I put my twins who are 3.5 in the back seat. And there's, if you don't know an electric cargo bike, it's a big thing. And I bike downtown Los Angeles and around. There's a global community of people who use this bike. And we're able to connect because of social media. I think there's a lot of space for innovation of tapping into these types of communities. I do think a lot of ethnically bound communities, and this can be, and also communities of people who think alike. And this can be pluses and minuses. So there's like both the fantastic elements of communities that can grow very quickly. And then we've seen lots of ways in which it can hurt democracy as well.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And the ability to target niches is really extraordinary. But at some point, I wonder if it's then becomes an inhibitor.
Jay, can I chime in on that point for a second? Although that's not my world. I think we are getting to a place where there's going to be so much saturation of bombardment of information. that people are going to start looking for something that is not packaged for them. And I think if I were to look at starting something, I'm your first client because I want something that is not biased. I want something that puts the facts in front of me. I want something that stimulates my analytical mind, not my emotions, because I don't want to be stimulated emotionally to be pissed off at somebody or be happy because I heard something that I wanted to hear. I want stimulation of my analytical part of my mind that allows me to look at it, come to a conclusion. If you can create something like that, I think the vast majority of people are looking for that. But it doesn't
I would
exist.
hope you're right, but that is not what the Facebook data is showing us. And that's what I thought was really scary listening to the whistleblower. And I think we have to pay attention to that.
No, I agree with you on that. But, they have 1 billion. There's still 6 billion out there. I'm one of them who's not on Facebook. So
I mean, you're like that minority. So that's a niche community.
Well, and here's the thing, the ability to carve out and target niches, starts to work against the concept of community, right? Or the Great Park development. You go there and there's people of every ethnic group, of every interest, of every profession. It's a geographic neighborhood, right? It looks as though it's becoming a neighborhood in terms of sense of place also. But that's not automatic anymore because I think, Danielle, what you're saying is the bike enthusiasts can stay online and find their community and maybe go on the weekend and meet up and everything else, may not know their neighbor.
And this is something, when we did the work in Alhambra, we really saw parallel communities where you had the Latino community was a little bit more connected to East Los Angeles, the white community there to South Pasadena, the Asian community was, and this is broad, but trying to move to Arcadia. And so people live close together, but they may not be connecting. And they may have Alhambra was an interesting example because it's an independent city of about 100,000. So like they have their own school district. They have certain commonalities that will link people together, but it does not always. And especially if you don't have media that's connecting you, telling the stories of people who you might not connect with on the social networks. That makes a huge difference.
And the truth is, we don't have that media now. You mentioned the kids in your class don't read the LA Times. Their parents don't read the LA Times. That was once the newspaper of record. We have 3 major national newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Washington Post, who have kind of made it in the digital age. And everyone else, is certainly not newspaper of record or any kind of common ground. As Emil said, we have the niche approach on cable TV. You pick your partisan channel and get your confirmation. Emil, I want to ask you, quite literally common ground, public space. Well, in your communities, there's a big emphasis and priority put on public space. Will that have to do for now until the media does reform and maybe we do come up with that sort of common ground through media, because I don't see it now. What role can public space play in this?
Well, look, from my perspective, as you know, public space plays a huge role. When I talk about, soccer stadiums that we build for youth, I don't talk about them only in terms of sports and the opportunity they provide for people to excel in their talent. I talk to them in terms of parents who are sitting next to each other who have no idea who they are. And they don't know who's wealthy, who's not. But there's a moment that is emotional at that time when one of the kids scores a goal and the parents high-five each other. And the connection is made that is much more natural than a lot of the other connections that we're talking about, because it's a human reaction, an emotional reaction. And I always say that moment might change people's lives. Same thing with an amphitheater. We have an amphitheater. I go there and I look back and I'm listening to music, which is nice. and I'm seeing people cheer. But I am sure that there are people over there who are sitting next to each other who at the moment in time when they're reciting the lyrics of a song, they connect. And all we're trying to do with these spaces is create a place where people bombard with trying to find a connection that is based on one and only one thing, which is humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Because, everything else is artificial. I mean, countries are artificial. A lot of things are all made up to have us believe that we belong there. But at the end of the day, our survival as species is only going to be based on, do we believe in humanity or not? And that's what public space does. I think it connects people based on just a moment of emotions.
Danielle?
One of the things we talk about a lot is this concept of public square, and the idea, sort of this Habermasian idea of people in French coffee shops talking. Where do people convene and connect, but also talk about the issues that make up democracy? And I think what's interesting, what you talk about is that emotional element that brings us together, and that the soccer field, and I think when we're thinking about, and I often talk about this in my courses with students, but it's the physical public square, it's the geographic one, and then we're also creating digital ones. And how do you create ones that create authentic connection, but also where people can come together and work to make their communities better?
I agree.
And then, it's interesting, we talked a little bit about the pitfalls and also the great benefits of the digital age. And, you just mentioned now that there's the good and the bad to the emotion. So before we were talking about those negative emotions that polarization causes, and now this positive emotion of people connecting at a soccer game. And, you start to get us at just how complicated or how, I guess, tangled this whole situation, our lives, right? It's a tangled life.
But Jerry, look.
Certainly.
That's your world, both of you. What we're talking about at the end of the day is human communication. Mm-hmm. And communication has been communication all through the history of man and woman. So there's a bad and there's a good side of communication. How many times have we said things or written something that we regretted? But at the same time, communication has been the main reason why we are where we are as a species. And the one thing I think I will tell you that I think I miss, which I never thought I would, is sitting there and writing a letter and then crumbling it and throwing it in the trash and then thinking about it again and saying, no, I'm going to get back to it tomorrow. That gave us an ability to think about the words and what we're communicating. Today, you get 16 different emails within a minute, and you feel obligated to respond to all of them. You're not thinking about what you're saying. You're more thinking about making sure that you respond in real time. So I think that what we're talking about is nothing but communication at the end of the day. And there's always good and bad in communication.
And I've thought about it. If you put smartphones in the hands of everybody and essentially give them the power of a printing press, right? Is it any surprise we're having some trouble figuring out how we communicate? It is. This advance, when you look at it in the terms of the capacity, this has given the average person. It is enormous, and it happened very quickly. Are we, I guess, two questions. Are we simply out of sorts? Is this to be expected? You can't bring this sort of change and expect everybody to just proceed smoothly and efficiently and politely, I guess. And the other case is, do we have time to make these adjustments? Because this digital age moves very quickly, and we seem to be, to me, we swerve. We go too far one way as a society, whether it's political or whatever else we're doing. Too far one way, and we go to correct, and we go too far the other way. And we've been swerving, I think, going back to the hanging Chad, now that I think about it. I think we've been swerving ever since. So should this all be expected, these difficulties, and do we have time to get this straightened out?
Well, look, I'll tell you, do we have time? We always have time. I actually think there's more good than bad that's coming out of social media and all the things we're talking about. We're basically just highlighting the areas that might be risky. I'll tell you, I believe that social media ultimately could act as a way to break down a lot of barriers that we grew up with. And I'll give you an example. If you didn't know anybody in Haiti and there was an earthquake in Haiti, you watch it on TV, you feel bad, but you move on to your other thing you want to watch. But if you have friends on social media in Haiti and you talk to them every day, and there's an earthquake in Haiti, you're going to be glued to the TV, you're going to be on the phone, you're going to be trying to get to them, and all of a sudden you have a connection with somebody who lives in Haiti who you had no connection with. So if you think about, I think, the benefit of it, there's a lot of benefit. Do we have time? We always have time. And you know what, you're right, the pendulum always swings to one side and the other side, but it somehow finds its balance in the middle. And as long as people are having dialogues like this one at every level, we will. But I'll finish with this. Human nature is not going to change, Jerry. People will not behave because we are, we're Dennis the Menace. We that's who we are. We're not going to behave and assume that because you give people things, they're going to be responsible. That's human nature.
Danielle, you're with the younger generation all the time, or not all, but in class. How do you worry for the future?
I'm more of a worrier than you are. I worry about what's going to happen next. Excuse me. I'm not going to answer if we have time or not, because who knows. But I think we're facing incredible challenges and incredible opportunities. But I think the different ways in which people are getting news and the lack of really thoughtful news. Most people don't, like I was talking to LA Taco yesterday, which I love, the news outlet, but most of the people who get their Instagram posts don't go to the stories. And that's pretty similar with many news outlets. And so to bring it to the question of news, the objectivity, the in-depth coverage, that is suffering in the way in which it brings people together. And social media is really having a detrimental effect on them.
Let me end it with this. Okay, we'll wrap up, and thank you both very much for this. Has been a very enjoyable conversation for me, and I hope illuminating for the audience. Who's responsible for this? Are parents responsible for teaching their kids? Are each of us responsible as taxpayers or community members? Is Google responsible? Is the government responsible? If there's reason for concern, I think we all agree there's reason for concern. To what degree, we don't know. Who's responsible?
Responsible for the good, you mean, or for the bad?
Well, if you accept the premise that we're in a tough spot right now, who's responsible for reversing this? Or you pointed out it's a trend. It seems to be getting worse. How do we get it to turn the other way?
Look, I mean, I don't know that you can put the burden on a teacher or a parent. As they say, it takes a village to raise a child. I think that, we all have to be responsible. We all have to be responsible. Whether you're a parent, you have to be responsible. Whether you're a teacher, you have to be responsible. Well, most important is that the people who are supposed to be the role models for all of us, and those are people who we elect in public offices to form policy and lead us to peace and do all the things that they're responsible for a nation. I would start with them, because I think they should be the ones who should be more responsible than anybody else, because they have the ability to create more emotional inflammation than anybody else. But I think it's going to be on all of us. I think everybody, but it really has to start with those who could cause the most damage.
Daniela, you're with a major educational institution. What's your view on this?
I agree with him. We're all responsible. We are all implicated. You may not be on Facebook. We're on Facebook right now. Like, we are all being touched by this. And I do think we have to pay attention to what is happening behind the scenes of these companies. And even as we use them as extraordinary tools, and I teach my students how to use them, but we also have to be cognizant of the destruction happening as well.
Got it. Well, listen, I think we'll leave it there. And I want to just thank you both very much. Again, I enjoyed this very much and learned a great deal. So thank you for your perspectives and for joining me.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Daniela.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.